Bona tarda a tothom. Gràcies per venir a CIDOB. En aquesta ocasió començarem el debat que porta per nom Countdown to Brexit. És un debat que el tindrem en anglès i en tot cas si hi ha preguntes que després l'audiència vol fer en català o castellà faré de traductor pel Matthew, que el tinc aquí a la meva esquerra, i l'ambaixador segur que també podrà respondre moltes preguntes. So, as I said, it's a pleasure to have this discussion here on Brexit. Brexit has been one of the topics that we've been following most closely at CIDOB for the last few months, years. And it's one, I mean, I'm particularly interested every time we discuss Brexit in the sort of discussions that we have, because it encompasses everything about what's going on currently in the European Union. You can frame the Brexit discussion under many angles. You can frame it under the future of the European Union, which we've done before. You can frame it under the notions of whether populism is running across Europe or not, and Brexit as one of the symptoms of these discussions. You can frame it under the idea of divisions within the countries of Europe, be that rural, urban, youth, old people, educated, less educated people. So there are plenty of ways to look at Brexit, and all of them basically converge on the topic that we discuss on every occasion here at CIDOB. Of course, we are very happy that for this discussion, for this particular discussion, we have quite of a mixed panel. So on the one hand, on my left-hand side, we have Matthew Goodwin, who's a very good researcher and very knowledgeable on the politics of the UK, and who's been writing and publishing a few books on UKIP and the rise of populism in the UK, so very knowledgeable about the political dimensions of Brexit, but beyond Brexit, of the UK in general. So that is basically what he will deal with in his first remarks. If I'm not mistaken, he can lead me in another direction. Then on my right side, we have Simon Minley, who is the ambassador of the UK to Spain. So of course, he will provide us with a more official view. No, not boring. I wouldn't say boring. But on the state of play of the negotiations, and that of course is very welcome as well. And then last but not least, we have Berta Barbet, who's a local expert on UK politics, on populism, and also the UK political system, and that will also provide us a complementary view to what we'll be discussing. I would still like to bring in the EU dimension into it, because I think, as I said, that Brexit also speaks a lot about the state of play of the European Union itself, not only about the Brexit negotiations or the UK-EU future relationships. So in a sense, I would like to also you to reflect on these issues. So from the different angles of Brexit and from the different perspectives of Brexit that we will be having tonight, I would just basically leave it here from my side, and I will come back to you with a few questions after your first 5 to 7 minutes introduction that you can basically deliver as you please, and then we will also open the floor for discussion. The only constraint that we have is that we must finish sharp at 5 to 8, because there are planes and trains to catch. So that's the only compulsory rule of this discussion that we're having tonight. So I would suggest that we start with Matthew. Thank you very much for coming to Barcelona.
Thank you all for giving up your time to come along to the event, and thank you to the Institute and to my fellow panelists for joining as well, and for hosting. I don't want to take too long, but I want to set out 3 points. The first is a summary of evidence on why people voted for Brexit. The second is where British public opinion is today. Are they changing their minds? What do they want? And the third is what I think will happen over the next 3 months, which potentially will be the most important 3 months in British politics for much of recent political history. The first point, we now have a large research literature on Brexit. Brexit studies is becoming a subgenre of political science, and those studies, when they look at why people voted for Brexit, tell a very consistent story. This is not a mystery. This is not really up for debate. Quantitative, qualitative studies all suggest that people who voted to leave did so for mainly two reasons. One was an attempt to reclaim sovereignty and to reclaim powers for the nation state from the European Union. And the second, and I would argue more important motive, was to lower the amount of immigration into Britain and to reform freedom of movement. Both of those motives went hand in hand. If you look at the British election study, which asked Leavers and Remainers in their own words why they voted the way they did, revealed that for Leavers, sovereignty and migration were often intertwined, that when people thought about sovereignty, they weren't only thinking about laws and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, but they were also partly thinking about borders, migration and ways of life. For Remainers, it was far more about that notion of economic risk, and to a lesser extent values around internationalism and an effective attachment to Europe. But I would argue that actually, contrary to much coverage, Brexit was not actually an aberration. It was not a radical departure from Britain's political tradition. I would argue that the vote to leave was actually quite consistent with Britain's long Eurosceptic tradition, and only part of it was populist. There was a very strong overlap between people who had voted for the UK Independence Party and then went on to vote for Leave. About 70% of Leave voters had either voted for the UK Independence Party or said that they would consider voting for that party. So there was a strong overlap, but it wasn't the whole story. There was also an element to Brexit which was just standard British politics that wasn't a sort of populist backlash, and I think many Brits would probably push back against the idea that Brexit should inevitably be in the same camp as Marine Le Pen or the Lega Nord in Italy or the Austrian Freedom Party. The second key thing to say is that actually in the 2 years since the vote, not a lot has changed in terms of public opinion. If you ask people in hindsight, was Britain right or wrong to vote to leave the European Union, in the latest poll about 46% say Britain was wrong, 42% say Britain was right. The margin of error in opinion polls is 3 points. We've not seen any big regret in terms of people saying that they should not have taken that decision, and nor, by the way, have we seen any strong majority support for a second referendum. There are different ways of asking that question. You can either have a second referendum on Remain or Leave, or you could have a second referendum on the terms of Britain's exit. Do you accept the so-called Chequers deal that was tabled by Theresa May, or would you want a no deal, such as falling back on the World Trade Organization rules? However you frame that question, support for a second referendum basically peaks at about 45%. So we have not seen a mass upsurge of public support for a second referendum. And I should also add that neither the Conservative Party nor the Labour Party are officially committed to a second referendum. So I think the chances of one taking place are still very unlikely, very low. The UK's Constitution Unit recently concluded that the time that it would take, just as a side note, to organise a second referendum would be, at its quickest point, 22 weeks. That would obviously take us beyond the current amount of time that we have left in the Article 50 negotiations, and so you'd be looking at an extension of Article 50, which of course then would mean that the UK would be holding European Parliament elections, and all of this suddenly, I think, begins to take us into the realm more of fantasy than reality, but we can talk about that. The other point to note as well, just about public opinion, is that when you ask people what do they really want out of the negotiation between the UK and the EU, the UK is very divided. About half of the population say they want to prioritise trade. The other half say they want to prioritise immigration control. It's clear that when you look at what most voters are thinking about within the terms of that deal, that ideal deal for the Brits would not really be consistent with where the EU negotiation position is, so inevitably there's going to be quite a lot of disappointment. The withdrawal agreement obviously is the first priority for Theresa May. 90 to 95% of that withdrawal agreement, as far as I'm aware at least, is signed off and agreed. The issue of the backstop in Northern Ireland remains outstanding. But I'll make one prediction about what might happen now. Theresa May has to bring back any agreed exit deal to the UK Parliament. UK Parliament then votes on that deal. I think there will be a big legally binding fudge on the issue of Northern Ireland, but I do think Theresa May will pass that meaningful vote, either by having a lot of discipline within the Conservative Party alongside the Democratic Unionist Party, and perhaps 6 or 7 or 8 defecting Labour members of Parliament, or she will simply have enough within the working majority that she has to pass that vote, given that the prospect for Conservatives, were the government to be brought down, which I think is actually unlikely, would be a Jeremy Corbyn government. And the internal logic for most Conservatives is that, well, the only thing that unifies the Conservatives at the moment is not going to the country to hold an election, and certainly not having Jeremy Corbyn anywhere near number 10 Downing Street. So if we get to a position where that meaningful vote is passed in October or November, then that really takes the heat out of the call for a second referendum. It ensures that Britain will effectively pass through the Article 50 Brexit day at the end of March. Theresa May will then likely be removed as leader of the Conservative Party, but we will then enter a 2-year protracted negotiation about the new trading relationship. So there are ways to get through the end of Article 50 as far as Britain is concerned. One is that the political declaration that will also join that withdrawal agreement will be incredibly vague, vague perhaps almost to the point of being meaningless, in that it will give Conservative Eurosceptics enough to get on board, but it will also give Conservative Remainers and perhaps some Labour MPs enough to perhaps ally themselves with that agreement. But it will ensure, I mean, this is a somewhat optimistic scenario in a way for the Conservative Party, but it will ensure that lots of questions, it will ensure that Britain gets through the end of Article 50, but it will ensure that lots of questions remain on the table. One is the future direction of the Conservative Party, which is obviously incredibly divided over the issue and still has no consensus over where it wants to take Britain's relationship with Europe. The second big issue is, what will the nature of that trading relationship be? Conservatives will increasingly flock behind a free trade agreement and move away from the Chequers deal. And the third, I think, key issue will be, how will British voters continue to respond to the negotiations? The default position at present is they effectively want the government just to get on with it and get it done. But we are looking at a prospect whereby this issue may continue to be discussed and debated and dominate and will continue to dominate Britain's agenda for potentially the next 2.5, 3 years. So while we're seeing a little bit of a shift among voters, a very, very small shift towards the idea of perhaps holding some kind of vote, the mechanics of that look unlikely. And so I think much of this will carry on as we are at the moment, which, to be honest, as a academic specialising in Brexit, is pretty close to being hell, given that it's the only thing I talk about every day. But there's some things there that we can get into and tease out. Obviously, I can go into a lot more detail on the specifics, but the broad thrust of where we are, I think, is actually, dare I say it, a little bit more clearer and a little bit more straightforward than some of the coverage would have you believe.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for the first remarks. Sharp on time, British time, very good. So, Ambassador.
No pressure, thank you. Paul, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always good to be in Barcelona. It's always particularly good to be here at Theodore. So thank you for inviting me again. Inviting me back, which must say something about the last time I came. So that's always good news. And thanks, Matthew. I think particular thanks to Matthew, because I probably spend more time in meetings, whether they be with business or politicians or journalists here in Spain, answering questions about the prospects of a second referendum than I do answering anything about the substance of our departure from the European Union. So I think it's really useful to hear from Matthew, as you say, how little opinion has actually changed, including on the question of a second referendum. Personally, like you, I just don't see it happening. And I think there's a real danger, actually, and to be honest, I hear more talk about second referendum in Spain than I do actually back home in the UK. And I think that may just be something about, there's a sudden interest in referendums in here, particularly in this town, I find. But I think there's a danger in it, to be honest. And there's a danger in all this talk. And I can understand why people here are attracted to it, because I understand the regret that many people here expressed to me in private and in public about the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. But it was their sovereign decision in a legitimate referendum. I think it's really incumbent upon government to respect the will of the people expressed in that referendum. And I think there's a real danger for us all, not just the British, but for all of us, all Europeans, if we get distracted by the speculation about the possibility of a second referendum and lose sight of the real issue of the moment in this issue. And I realise there are lots of other things going on in Europe other than this. But if we lose sight of the real issue, which is how can we strike an agreement between the UK and the European Union in the very limited time frame that we have, an agreement which will enable us to move forward, that enables the departure of the UK on time next March from the European Union, but which sets us on a path, and as Matthew rightly says, this does not end in March next year, it doesn't end this month at the European Council. This is going to be a long process of negotiation and transition to a new situation. But I think we do have to look beyond where we are today to where we want to be in the future, and where I'd like us to be in the future at the end of this process, after our departure from the European Union, after the transition, is a place where Britain is not just, as it has been and always will be, a close neighbour of the European Union, but is also Europe's best friend, is the European Union's best ally in the world, closest ally in the world, its closest trading partner, its closest security partner, a partner with whom we can work to promote European values in the world and secure Europe's security and prosperity. Now, the immediate task in the next few weeks, and it is only a few weeks to the European Council, is to address two issues, key issues. One of which, as Matthew says, is the economic relationship, the future economic relationship with the European Union. We're not going to come out of the next couple of weeks clearly with a detailed agreement between the UK and the European Union on every nut and bolt of that agreement, but we do need to have a sense of where it is we are going. What's the sort of relationship that we wish to establish between the UK and the European Union? We obviously hope that that's a relationship which is going to be close and open, that is going to involve frictionless trade in goods in particular, that has the closest possible alignment of standards in services. We hope it's a relationship too in security. We haven't spoken very much about security, but we face common threats, and we need to establish a framework in which we can continue to collaborate between our police forces, our security forces, our intelligence agencies, to confront the threats that we face, whether they be from Islamist terrorism or from Russia. So the first set of issues that we have to confront are those around the future relationship. The second is about this issue of Northern Ireland and the Republic. And in all honesty, if you look at the Chequers proposal, if you look at the proposal we put forward and presented to our European partners, much of the impulse behind that proposal comes from our desire to avoid two things, both of which are equally dear to the British government. The first is to avoid a return to a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. You know, we have spent decades now trying to free ourselves from the horrors of what we call in the UK the Troubles. The violence between the communities in Northern Ireland that so scarred the history of Northern Ireland from the late 60s through to the 90s. And one of the fundamental pillars of that, reflected in the Belfast or Good Friday agreements, is of course the absence of a hard border in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But the proposal that the Commission made to us, a so-called backstop, puts, in its effort to avoid that, posits as an alternative effectively a customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, akin to putting a customs border between Castilla-La Mancha and Castilla-León. It's separating our country in two by a customs border. That too is unimaginable to any British government, and it's also, I think, unimaginable too in terms of the peace process in Northern Ireland because of the attachment of the majority Protestant population in the north of Ireland to the union with the rest of the United Kingdom. So what the proposals that we put forward in Chequers are an attempt to resolve those two issues in Northern Ireland, to find a way through this which enables you to avoid both a hard border in the north, or between the north of Ireland and the Republic, and a customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So those are the two big issues that we have to resolve in the next few weeks. But I just want to add two more things. One, we haven't spoken about it so far, but really important issue, and in the presence of my Consul General in Barcelona, I have to flag it up, and that's people. The key issue for us through much of the first part of the negotiations, and a key issue for the European Commission too, has been the rights of citizens. And we made really important gains on that issue in the December and March European Councils, in which we agreed that basically the rights of those 3 million European citizens living in the UK and the million-odd Brits living in Europe, including 300,000 here in Spain, would be protected upon our withdrawal from the European Union. It's really, really important that we secure those rights in the withdrawal treaty in a bit of international legal order so as to enshrine them for the future. We've made very clear that even if there is no agreement, that we will protect the rights of European citizens living in the UK. We hope that other countries will do the same in respect of Brits living in their countries, but the best solution to this, the best way in which we can give certainty to people living across the European Union is to enshrine all of that in an international treaty that would be the withdrawal treaty. And the last thing I'd say is, look, we don't have long to go in this negotiation, but we're playing for very high stakes. And we're playing for high stakes not just because of the economic importance of the relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union, or even the security relationship that we have, and the risks of undermining the security of our continent in all of this. But I think it is important at a kind of geopolitical level that we can show that here in Europe we can face the hard challenges that confront us, and that we can find solutions. There are some in the world who think that the European Union is incapable of confronting the hard challenges it faces and finding solutions. And I think we need all of us, not just our government, but the governments of our European partners and friends and the European Commission, to show the flexibility, the ambition and maturity over the next few weeks to come to agreements that will be in the interests of the security and the prosperity and the future of all of us who call ourselves Europeans.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let's move back to academia and the broader view on Brexit with Berta Barbet, who's a postdoc researcher at the Autonomous University of Barcelona.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm gonna kind of make a very big step kind of backwards, because this has been a very concrete and nice set of talks on very specific issues, and I used to be very involved in British politics and be very updated. But then I moved here, and apparently we have our own things to deal with. So I don't know that much about the details, but I do know, I do have a broader perspective on what is going on in Europe and what it is that is kind of shaping our political system. That is probably something that's going to affect, well, no, it's clearly something that's going to affect the negotiation and the result of the negotiation and where the future British political and democratic system. In doing so, I'm sorry, Matthew, but I'm going to borrow a lot of your ideas, so it's going to be very unsurprising for you what I'm going to say, but hopefully not for the audience. So basically what we're having in the UK with Brexit and in our countries, but especially in the UK with Brexit, is a reshaping of the political system due to this, right now quite mentioned, new conflict on the globalization, integration versus demarcation. And the idea that for a very long time we had kind of accepted that globalization is a new thing, and now suddenly we have parties and voters kind of challenging this view and kind of saying, actually we're not that thrilled with what is going on. We know that supporters of these anti-globalization movements are dissatisfied with the political system, but also that they're pessimistic about how society has evolved. They even are many times nostalgic about how it was in the past. They want to kind of have this very nice way of putting it that the Brexit campaign did. They want to take back control. And in that sense, there are two dimensions in which the globalization has affected citizens and two dimensions in which they want to complain about it. One is what we call the openness of borders to citizens and the immigration issue. And the other one is the openness of countries to goods and services and the trade or protection issues. As Matthew Amfor very nicely put, the two issues, although they belong to the same conflict, they challenge differently the views of the left and the right parties of the system. For the left-wing parties, the challenge is mainly on their economic project. There is some kind of a challenge on how to create a system of welfare state in this globalized world, and those voters that are dissatisfied with the policies of the social democratic parties are usually mad at how they've managed the economy. On the right-hand side, what we have is kind of frustration over the immigration issue and how it has affected the culture and the nation as it was. It's kind of a more cultural problem. I think that the last years we've seen that the right-wing parties have been very have been more skillful in dealing with the issue probably, and they've actually kind of accepted quite a lot of the claims made by the anti-globalization process. And we were probably seeing with the Brexit, at least the after Brexit, the strategy of the conservative parties that they've kind of accepted, especially, like they've obviously accepted the will of the people in the referendum, but they've kind of embraced mostly the let's take control of the immigration in the country. Because it was the issue where they could move more freely, which is the issue that was kind of bothering their voters more. However, and I think this is what's creating this kind of confusion that we're living in now. The European Union strategy has kind of made that impossible because it has said, no, it's both or none. You cannot get to just decide to deal with one of the two dimensions of the globalization. You either close both borders or one. or none, sorry. And this is going to be interesting because this clearly affects the kind of alliances that will be created in the UK. Now, in the negotiation, and we're seeing how the Conservative Party is dealing with this internal tension, but also the Labour Party, there's kind of clear tension on all sides, because it's very clear that there is one border that everyone kind of has accepted that should be closed. But it's less clear that the goods and services border has to be closed, and so you have to find a balance there. It's not easy. But not only that's important, also who is going to kind of win on this situation, because as Matthew said, the Brexit was won by part of the voters that were populist, but it was also won by conservative voters that just wanted to kind of like take back the political control, but not necessarily the anti-globalization part. And they kind of created an alliance there. There was kind of an agreement, and let's all agree that outside the European Union we're going to have a better life. But it's not clear that they agree on what kind of agreement they want to reach now. And this is probably going to be key, not only in the next months, but in the next 5 years, 2 years. And probably it's going to shape the structure of the political system, the alliances created at the end of the process. And also very likely the alliances created in the other European unions, because as Paul was saying, Europe is kind of watching, and Eurosceptics in other countries will kind of have to come up with a strategy on how to deal with whatever strategy European Union leaders are choosing.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think there were very complementary views on in the panel, and I have a difficult task in asking a few questions that could appeal to all of you, but there's one that I think that you have all touched on the issue, but not necessarily, I mean, discussed thoroughly, and it's a bit of a conceptual discussion that we might have here, but I think it might be appealing to all of you. I mean, you are all, in a sense, speaking about sovereignty, and at the very end, it's a question about whether you share more sovereignty, you are within the different dimensions of supranational sovereignty, and the consequences that it has. That, as I think Berta was rightly mentioning at some point, this was not so much contested. It was not so much discussed. It was part of, basically, the way our societies are becoming increasingly integrated, but that has found very strong backlashes in the recent years, not only in the UK, but across Europe. The thing is that, as Ambassador was mentioning, the objective is still to have a very intertwined relationship between the UK and the EU. So my question is, to what extent, by putting forward a discussion on regaining sovereignty and on building a UK that is more capable by itself, by establishing links with others and doing it its own way, to what extent isn't there an inherent contradiction between the regaining sovereignty on the one hand and wanting an agreement that at the very end it also at best will put you in a situation whereby you will not be very independent at the end of the day, because you will still be very much intertwined with the rest of the partners that you build alliances with, that you have to abide by the rules that, of those alliances, and that at the very end, basically, you are changing the framework, but not necessarily the contents of the framework at best case scenario. So the best case scenario is that we actually all reach that very comprehensive agreement and that very friendly relationship for the future. But the key questions remain the same. And Matthew and Berta were both saying, well, there was very much an immigration issue here. And I don't think that Brexit will very much change the issue of the need for labor force, the need for aging societies and recovering from aging societies, the need to import people. So that, regardless of Brexit, will still be key dimensions in our societies. And I don't think Brexit will provide a definitive answer to the big questions that are around the sovereignty. And I put sovereignty to put it like a name to it, but you know what I am referring to, which at the very end brings us back to the original discussion of closed versus open. So to what extent do you think that no matter how it ends, sovereignty will remain a key mobilizing force in UK politics? So,
well, I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it depends on what the final trade deal is going to be. If we end up in a sort of EEA, very soft type of Brexit, then I agree that you have to ask a question of what was it all for? What was the point? That would have serious domestic political consequences, mainly for the Conservative Party, because that type of soft Brexit deal that basically looks like the status quo but with less influence and less power for the UK would cause significant problems politically. But let's just go back briefly to why we got here in the first place. The fundamental miscalculation that Remainers made was that they assumed people were only thinking about the domestic risks of Brexit, when in fact most people who were either leavers or leaning towards leave were mainly concerned about what they saw as being the external risks within the European Union. And those were freedom of movement, refugee crisis, divisions between EU member states, and institutions that did not look sufficiently transparent or accountable. Most of the leavers I know, just on a personal note, most of the leavers I know in the academic community voted leave because of the treatment of Greece and the imposition at different points of governments that were not seen to be sufficiently accountable to ordinary citizens. Most of the leavers I know in the north of England, away from the universities, voted for leave mainly because of freedom of movement, and they felt that a high migration, low skill environment was not conducive to their economic and social position. So long as the Brexit deal gives the UK flexibility on those issues, which allows the UK to be close to the EU but sufficiently far enough to have control over that migration policy and also control over its institutions and be a bit more removed from Brussels, then I think actually leavers will be not too bothered about what that conception of sovereignty is, but they will feel that the external risks are a little bit more over here rather than within their nation state where they felt they had no control. Today, Theresa May set out the immigration framework that will follow Brexit, or the ideal immigration framework. And we have to remember, we talk about immigration in very general terms. Well, the UK wants to move to a skill-based migration policy that prioritises high-skilled migration and cuts down on low-skilled migration. That is not saying the UK doesn't want any immigration. It's saying that the UK wants to build a social and economic settlement that is geared more toward promoting skill-based forms of inward migration. And of course, I understand why that's difficult for the EU because it points toward an economic settlement that over the longer term is likely to be more productive and over the longer term is more in tune with British public opinion. The EU was never able, and I think if we had this conversation in 10 years, I think the EU will come to regret not giving David Cameron more during the renegotiation in early 2016. Because if the EU cannot be more flexible on these very, very, very important issues about borders and security and identity, then in my personal view, Brexit is the beginning of a much longer challenge to the European Union. I'm constantly talking to Italians, to Austrians, to Swedes, to the Dutch, who are saying, the drivers of Brexit are perfectly visible within their nation states too, and we have to find a way of making people within the European Union feel more secure, with stronger borders, and in a way that I think is more responsive to public opinion in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, along those lines, feel free to comment as well, but what are the possibilities of a no deal?
Okay, let me deal with no deal in a second, but just so I thought Matthew's answer there was very interesting, as was your question, of course.
That was a very obvious one.
No, but they're two really good questions, and Matthew's alluded to some of it. I mean, first of all, sovereignty. I think one of the oddities, if I may say, kind of looking at British public opinion, is that the British people are actually very relaxed about some aspects of sharing sovereignty. And Article 5 of NATO is perhaps, one of the greatest forms of sovereignty sharing going, and the British people, I think, are probably more comfortable with that than many other European nations. But it is clear, and has been clear, as you said, Matthew, this is not, the referendum did not emerge out of nowhere. It emerged out of a long-running disquiet amongst the British people about where Europe was going, in a sense that they had joined something that had turned into something slightly different, in a sense that they hadn't been given a say over those developments. So, I don't actually see a contradiction in the end between an agreement which preserves the really close economic and political ties that we have with the European Union, in particular that enables trade to thrive and security collaboration to continue, with us being formally outside the European Union, because I think there is something quite fundamental about the British political debate which says, actually, the way that Europe is moving along a track of political integration, recognise that's the logic of the Eurozone, Schengen and the rest, just that we don't actually want to be part of that political project. We do want to have the closest possible economic security and other links with Europe on immigration. We are a remarkably open country. We're one of the few European member states, and I was kind of part of that decision making, that opened its labour market in full in 2004 to workers from all the new member states. Other countries decided to maintain transitional controls. We opened our labour markets. Had many positive economic effects. But at the end of the day, yes, people were worried about what was happening in their communities, about what it was doing in terms of jobs and living standards amongst lower skilled people. And we probably didn't invest enough in the public services in those areas which received the largest amounts of immigration, or the largest rises in immigration, so that schools, hospitals and things were not as well equipped as they should have been to cope with all of that. And I think, we have to be honest that for all the tremendous successes globally of globalization and what it's done to the European economy and what it can do to the European economy, we all in our societies have pockets of our population who have not seen the benefits of globalization and who look with some puzzlement and often anger at those areas of the country that have benefited. And we have, as governments, to try and address those areas of deprivation and give people the means to prosper in this era. On no deal, so look, I think we are working day in and day out to secure a deal. It's, I think, the responsibility of any government to prepare for all eventualities. I think the worst thing that we could do as a government is kind of continue merrily negotiating, find out that we either can't secure a deal or that deal is subsequently rejected, and then people say, well, did you not plan for this? So no, we are planning what would happen if no deal were reached. That's a pretty labour-intensive effort, as you would have heard, right across the British government, and talking to our European partners about what they would do in that exercise. The European Commission is doing the same thing, and encouraging member states to make their own preparations. We sincerely hope it won't happen for all the obvious reasons, but I think it's right and proper that we do that work.
Thank you. Bert, I have a question for you. I mean, you've worked quite a lot on UKIP, and you've referred to it slightly as Matthew has on this. To what extent do you think has UKIP become unnecessary? Let me explain that. I mean, to what extent the main issue in the UKIP's agenda, which was together with the most Eurosceptic branch of the Conservative Party, has become mainstream in the UK, and thus this could be seen as a positive side effect of basically leaving the UKIP out of the question, or as a negative side effect, which is having UKIP's agenda right in the middle of the general political dimension in the UK.
Well, I think UKIP, like, beyond its kind of political influence in terms of discourse and how they made mainstream parties afraid of losing votes so much that they kind of bought parts of the discourse, and that's why, in a way, some of their issues are on the agenda right now, despite their not being there. I think the party per se never had, I don't know how to say it, political power, because of the first participle system, that it's kind of something they've always struggled. I don't remember which year was the election that they were supposed to enter parliament, but
2015.
2015, because I have this kind of like massive thing that from 2000 on, for me, it's always the same year. But they were supposed to enter parliament, and they didn't, because first past the post is very strong limitation to enter parliament, especially when mainstream parties manage to kind of give you something that you can already say, okay, I like UKIP, but to be fair, I'd rather have Conservative than Labour. Then the incentive is there, and it's quite hard to overcome it, as we saw that year. So I don't think that their disappearance in terms of a party can be counted as either good or bad, because they were not. Like, in terms of political power, they never had it. In terms of political influence, I think that, and in that sense, I think it's very interesting what Simon and Matthew are saying. We'll see if after the Brexit, there's still some space for them to still be able to shape discourse, to still be able to say, but this is not enough, or kind of what Boris Johnson is doing, but not from inside the party. Or if the agreement and the issue are so settled that they clearly disappear, not only in terms of like gaining votes, but also in terms of having the political influence. I don't know if they have, but their discourse clearly has.
Mm-hmm. I'm tempted to go back to Brexit itself and talk about the EU itself. That I think it's also. I mean, I'd very much like to hear your views about not Brexit itself, not the future of the UK itself, but
Tottenham Hotspur versus Barcelona. No,
Barcelona.
But I mean, to a certain extent, what the EU is saying is, you cannot have everything. You cannot have the benefits and still want such a good agreement that you basically doesn't make a difference whether you're in or out, because at the end of the day, everything remains the same. And the EU says this is not possible. It's basically a way to show the door to others and say, well, listen, if the UK secured that, we can also secure it. So why bothering about being part of the EU? But on the other hand, what you are putting forward is an argument that the EU has to become more flexible. There must be a way to have different degrees of membership, different degrees of relations that do not involve all the classical dimensions of being member of the EU, but it can be something different, which I think to me is very difficult issue to tackle today, because the EU, if it is something as of today, maybe you are the avant-garde of something kind of a reform of the EU, but it's very sclerotic. It's very difficult for the EU right now, today, to basically change its overall perspective of how it deals with membership. I think it's something that it's beyond the scope and the possibility, the capabilities of the EU. So how do you see the EU in that regard? Should it reform itself to be more friendly to the UK, or is basically that you understand that the UK and the EU are two different things and they can go their own ways?
Your question reminds me of a question which was asked on the morning that David Cameron gave his Bloomberg address. It was asked of Alex Stubb, Finnish minister, and Alex was asked by the BBC, so David Cameron's making this speech today, he's suggesting a multi-speed Europe. Can you imagine such a thing? And he said, well, strange you should ask that. I actually have written a book on multi-speed Europe, and we've had a multi-speed Europe for 20 years. You know, I mean, the reality is, you know, Europe is already a kind of union of kind of many geometries, yeah? Not everybody's a member of the Eurozone, not everybody's a member of Schengen. I don't think we are suggesting that Europe should be more flexible. Europe has, you know, what I think we're saying is there is not a kind of ready-made agreement that's sort of in the kind of the Commission's desk drawer that's got UK written on it. Yeah, sometimes we are presented with the choice of, well, you have to choose. You have to choose whether you are Canada or you are South Korea or you're Switzerland. Right? No. Each and every one of these agreements is distinct and reflects the nature of the relationship the European Union has with that third country or aspires to have. And as a member state, an existing member state of the European Union that is leaving the European Union, we think it's right and reasonable that we have a more ambitious agreement than one that the European Union has ever had before. And we say that not because we think we're special, but because we think it's in our shared interests, the European Union and the UK, that we are able to continue to work together in future to promote our security and prosperity. And yes, the European Union is going to evolve, continue to evolve. It's always been evolving, and it will continue to evolve with the economic and social challenges that it faces.
Well, I think putting my cards on the table, I'm pretty, as you probably picked up from my comments, pretty sceptical about the longer term evolution of the EU for many reasons, but I think the Brexit negotiation in a way will become a test case for that longer term direction. And for the first time in the history of the European Union, a major state has voluntarily left, and by doing so has established what my colleague Catherine de Vries would call an alternative state. And it is the EU's job, for understandable reasons, to make that alternative state look as unattractive as possible. I understand that. That is partly coming from a position of weakness, in that on the one hand, the EU it needs to defend the single market, but on the other hand, it needs to walk a very tough line with the UK because it has a number of fires in its back garden. Matteo Salvini, Viktor Orban, Sweden Democrats, Alternative for Germany, North versus South, East versus West, sluggish growth, aging population, could go on. The UK, over the next 2 to 3 years, in terms of the deal, will, I think, look unattractive to Eurosceptic populists. But simply because of the mechanics of London, personally, my view is 5 to 10 years from now, that alternative state may look very different. Simply because of the sheer power of financial services. Simply because of the sheer power of the UK economy. I'm not a passionate fan of Brexit, but it was quite clear that Remainers overplayed their cards during the campaign, that London was going to fall under pressure to Frankfurt and Paris. that the UK economy is going to enter recession, that we were going to have 500,000 job losses. I don't say this just to be provocative, but if you're going to create a narrative that is based around fear, you need that narrative to be validated. And if it isn't, voters will lose interest. The UK economy has the lowest unemployment rate for 40 years. On balance, the economy is still growing, albeit quite in a sluggish way. We have lost 650, 700 jobs in the city. We have fintech, big technology companies investing in London. I don't see the picture of Armageddon that was painted during the Remain campaign. Now, I say that not to make a provocative point, but to make the point that if you want to understand why people are not changing their minds, then we need to start understanding the macroeconomic political context. Because while Britain has basically remained as it was, look at what the average British voter has seen in the EU. Catalonia, Greece, Orban, Le Pen, Sweden Democrats, refugee crisis. And if you're trying to convince those voters to change their minds, the external risks within the EU have actually magnified. They haven't dissipated. And that's the challenge, I think, for the EU over the longer term, is that learn from the British experience. The British experience, the number one lesson of the Brexit campaign is that when Euroscepticism merges with concerns over identity, it becomes incredibly potent. And for the first time 2 weeks ago, a study that was released by a political scientist in the Netherlands found exactly the same thing happening in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France. That as people think about the EU, they're increasingly beginning to think about borders, security, refugees, migration. And if you get Euroscepticism beginning to merge in that way, then you have a lot more people that are potentially susceptible to it. So the priority for the EU, and I'm not pulling any punches, it's got to fix the external border security issue. It's got to fix the refugee crisis. It's got to accept that if people say they want a little bit less immigration, that's not racist, that's not something that needs to be dismissed and thrown out of the room. It's got to understand that some of the grievances on which populism feeds are legitimate, that our institutions are not very representative of key groups like workers, that the EU needs to work harder to be democratically transparent and accountable, that we have to try and get more diverse voices around the table. So, it's almost a plea just to say, don't be mad at Britain, learn from Britain, right? That's the job for other EU member states. Learn how quickly political change can happen.
Good. Berta, is there anything you would like to add to this discussion? Otherwise, I'll open it up.
Yeah, I think it's better if you open the
Okay,
floor.
so we have a few minutes for a Q&A. As I said, we need to finish 5 to 8. So who would like to ask specific questions or a comment? I see 2 of them there, so who goes first? We will pick a few in, if that's okay.
Thank you very much for all your comments. My name is Carlos Bravo. I'm a predoctoral researcher at eBay. I have a comment and then one question. My comment is, I simply don't find it very surprising that support for the idea of a second referendum or even the idea of Brexit hasn't changed much among the UK electorate, given that the electorate hasn't felt the consequences of that decision yet. In my view, and this is a personal, obviously, opinion, we have to really see how the markets react after the terms of the deal or no deal are set. But that's just my comment. And then I have one question for Mr. Goodwin. Okay, thank you for your personal insights. For all your insights have been very, very interesting to me. I don't question the ability of Ms. May to gather enough majority or enough support to pass a proposal. at the UK Parliament in terms of a UK position in the negotiations. However, I'm wondering to what extent would she be able to craft something that is deemed as acceptable for the leaders at the EU Council? Thank you.
Can I pick another one right behind?
Yeah. I have two questions. One is more general and the other one is for the ambassador. So the more general one will be like, one of the reasons of European integration was the diminishing international roles of European states, seen for example in Suez crisis. So how you see the post-Brexit scenario regarding which future role will UK and European Union play on the global stage? And the question for the ambassador is, the African demographic rise expected might put an increase in immigration pressure, as have seen lately. So will the UK regard this matter only as an European Union matter or as a regional one? And how will it get involved in this issue?
Okay, unless there's another one? I didn't see it, sorry, yes. Just hang on.
So I was wondering if you could give us like some more detail on what type of political fudge on a solution for Ireland would be acceptable for the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland as well as for the EU.
Okay, and then I'll pick the last one here, and then we'll come back here.
Very short one. What about Scotland? Is there a referendum on the agenda?
Scotland. Okay, so feel free to pick any
Very
of the
briefly,
questions. That
just to be very brief though. Scotland, no. There's not currently majority support for a second referendum or for leaving. So Scotland is moved to the backdrop. But that may change if we end up having an election and we end up with Jeremy Corbyn and a coalition government potentially. That might be the price of a coalition for the SNP and Corbyn, which leads into your question, which is, well, Brexit hasn't happened yet. True, but I would say that this is just more anecdote than research, but I do a lot of work with the city and financial institutions. I'm not saying this because of personal bias, but they are reasonably relaxed at this point in terms of Brexit. The assumption is we will get a withdrawal agreement, we will have a transition which may be extended because it will be incredibly difficult to get an ambitious free trade agreement done in that time. But from the city's perspective, politically, yes, it's volatile, but the assumption, at least in terms of the people I'm talking to, is that contingency plans have gone in, the economy has proven to be more robust than people anticipated, and on we go. It's far from an ideal scenario. I get more calls about the risk of Jeremy Corbyn and a Labour government than I do than Brexit, because they want to nationalise industry, they want to completely reform corporation tax, they want to redistribute them more aggressively. Now, putting your personal politics to one side, there is a risk for the UK, which is a bad negotiation, not a no deal, because there's no majority in the UK Parliament for a no deal, but there is a prolonged negotiation that isn't optimal, and which is followed by a radical left-wing government in the UK, which from the city's perspective will be, I think, a two-punch combination to the UK, which will be a messy exit, not a very good trade deal, followed by quite a radical reforming Labour government, which I personally think will have more of an impact on the markets actually than Brexit will. But let's see if I'm right. And on the Northern Ireland backstop, the DUP, that you didn't hear this from me, this is under Chatham House rules, but I think the DUP would are we live streaming? Okay. The DUP, I think, would potentially be okay to support a time-limited backstop, which conceivably would be something like keeping Northern Ireland within some form of customs arrangement for a short period of time to get us into the longer-term trade negotiation, provided that happens within the current Parliament and the DUP are still very much at the heart of government. And I think that, there's a sense that on the EU side and the DUP side, the language around Northern Ireland is beginning to de-dramatise, is beginning to soften. And I think there may end up being a compromise. It could, for example, look like a fudge around, both sides commit to forming a legal working committee to prioritise the issue of the border as part of the first trade negotiation. I'm not sure exactly what the wording would be, but I can see the fudge of all fudges coming within 2 months. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe they won't find an answer, but that would be my indication. But I'm not looped into the same circles as some of us on the panel.
More addressed to me. So kind of on the international role, so the simple answer to that is we're investing. I think there are more young people joining our foreign service this year than there have been for decades. We're opening a whole load of new posts overseas. We're already, over the last 10, 15 years, we've sort of had our little Asian pivot. So we've already expanded massively in China and India, Malaysia, and other emerging markets. There's a new wave of that this year and next as we open posts in a number of emerging markets, filling kind of spaces on the map where we haven't had representation either for a while or ever. But the reality is what we want to be doing, of course, even if we are going to have more posts over the world, a bigger foreign service, is we want to continue working with the European Union on many of the big issues of the day, whether it be Iran or Venezuela. We will continue to look to our European partners as our partners of choice because of what we share in terms of our values and because of what we share in terms of our interests and our threats. On the sort of the demographic issue, of course, one of the oddities is that the UK currently faces a little less of a demographic crisis than some other EU member states, partly because of the very high levels of immigration we have had over the last few years. And just in parenthesis, one of the oddities of the Brexit campaign reported to me by various people campaigning for the Remain is quite how many of those new immigrants actually voted in favour of leaving the European Union. So again, it's wise, as Bertrand and Matthew said, not to slip into easy characterizations of those who voted for Brexit. But the reality is, and Matthew's touched on already, not because we are facing a particular demographic crisis, but because we will continue to want to attract the most talented from across the world, not just from Europe, but from across the world, to study in our universities and to work in our economy. We will continue to have an immigration policy that attracts the best and the brightest from across the world. It's not going to be the immigration policy we have today, dictated by being a member of the European Union, but it will be a policy that aims to ensure that we can, as Matthew said, be a high-skill, high-wage economy into the future.
Thank you. Berta, any?
I think all questions were questions.
I haven't seen any additional questions. Yes, there's an additional one, and then I'll make sure we close at 5:02. Just let me have the question, and then we'll go back.
I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on the issue of the Northern Ireland, because no matter what deal it is reached, the fact will always remain that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland would become an external border of the EU. Now, as far as I can remember, the Republic of Ireland didn't join Schengen not to put at risk the common area with the UK. So it is very difficult for me to understand how that can be solved. Whatever agreement do you reach, do you think it is going to be sustainable over time, in the long term?
Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? I mean, I think there are going to be ways forward. I think the island issue is incredibly important, but I do think that at points it's being used not for sincere purposes, but partly for political purposes as well. I think there are arrangements in place with other EU states, other borders that the UK and the EU can learn from. I think if you just look at the numbers, the type of trade that passes across that border, some of that is already being done at other ports. Some of it potentially could be facilitated by much of the online technological responses, not all of it. It's problematic, but I don't personally foresee that we're going to have large-scale infrastructure going up on the border. I'm happy to be wrong on that. I mean, the one thing that I don't think I'm certain will happen is that we will end up sort of, backsliding, changing our minds, going in some other direction because of that specific issue. I think there will be pragmatism. There will be a lot. I think we will hear a lot about constructive ambiguity this autumn. I think we'll hear a lot of nice words that avoid the real issue. I think the island issue overall will be resolved during the transition, not this autumn. And I think the words will be chosen incredibly carefully. But I think it will be ultimately resolved in one form or another. I can't give you the specifics. But I think as well, just lastly, because we're sort of approaching the end, so I've probably given you a classically British account of where I think we are, and I would have sort of appreciate that some of you will hold a radically different view of Brexit and this decision and where it leaves the UK and the EU. But I think the only place that a British person can be at the moment is a pragmatic place, and trying to think through how this decision can work and can be put in place over the longer term, because the alternative of holding another referendum, overturning the decision, trying to put the genie back in the bottle, from everything I've looked at in terms of public opinion and surveys and populism and alienation and apathy and anger, I suspect this outcome is preferable to that outcome. And trying to work through it collaboratively and productively, however much it may challenge some of our values or conventional wisdoms and so on, I think is ultimately where we need to be, and why discussions like this are good ones. So I'd like to just finish by saying thanks for actually making room for this discussion.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's been very refreshing. I mean, your views are not the ones that we are used to here sitting in Barcelona and discussing Brexit, but is there any final words from this side of the panel that you'd like to add?
No, I wanted to ask if you could very briefly answer my question. There is, once the withdrawal agreement is signed, and we have to talk about the new economic agreement, I wanted to know what would be, and you have to be very quick, so you have to take a stand here. What kind of deal do you think is more likely if the European Union keeps maintaining the current position that in order to be in the single market, you have to have freedom of movement?
Simple answer to that is we're not asking to be in the single market. We're asking for a free trade area in goods. We're recognising that services are going to be slightly different. We're recognising that the free trade agreements that the European Union has with states vary dramatically. And they reflect the economic and social and political context in which they're made. And we think that, as an exiting member state, we can and should be ambitious, because Matthew said, I think, while we should and we have to be very focused on the next few weeks and securing an agreement on the withdrawal agreement, on the transitional period, and on the kind of the outline of that future economic relationship, we also have to think about where we want to be in 5 or 10 years. And where I hope we want to be in 5 or 10 years is neighbours, partners, and friends working together to promote our security and prosperity. And that needs imagination, it needs determination, and a little bit of flexibility, but that's what it's about.
Okay, so let's hope for the best. It's a countdown, so it's only 178 days, if I'm not mistaken, to Brexit Day. So
we have Christmas before.
Yeah, and homework to do. So thank you very much for your presence here in this panel discussion, and thank you very much to all for